This is Joan with the Joan Jerkovich Show at 910 KINA Salinan, bringing you innovative talk radio that surprises, entertains, and sometimes informs you, and I will say especially today informs you. Because what I want to say to my listeners is that I have a challenge for you today. I'm going to challenge you to stay tuned for today's show because it may get a little bit heady, may get a little bit intellectual, and shall I say philosophical. But this is an important show for all of us to pay attention to, because today we're going to talk about the Occupy movement. And before I introduce my guests for today, I want to give you a little background on the Occupy movement. And this came about in mid-2011. The Canadian-based group called Adbusters Media Foundation, best known for its advertisement-free, anti-consumerist magazine, Adbusters, proposed a peaceful occupation of Wall Street to protest corporate influence on democracy, and to address a growing disparity in wealth and the absence of legal repercussions behind the recent global financial crisis. So social media sites that really fueled this cry for protest and Occupy Wall Street happened in New York City beginning on September 17, 2011. Now, the Occupy movement has turned into an international protest movement, primarily directed again against economic and social inequality. And so that by October of 2011, Occupy protests had taken place or were going on in over 95 cities across 82 countries and over 600 communities in the United States. And I know we haven't seen any here in Salina, but I was just in Denver and I certainly saw them walking in protest in that city down the main streets. Now, the other thing that I want to tell you is that the movement commonly uses a slogan called "We are the 99%." And this was launched as a Tumblr blog page in late August of 2011. And what it's referring to is the concentration of wealth among the top 1% of income earners compared to the other 99%. We are the 99%. The top 1% of income earners nearly tripled their after-tax income over the last 30 years, tripled it, according to a Congressional Budget Office report. So again, before I introduce my guest, I'm going to run down a list of what the protesters want. They want an end to the corrupting effect of money on politics. They want to reduce the influence of corporations on politics. They want to end tax evasion by wealthy firms. I'd like to see that. They want to tighten banking industry regulations and have more bank reform. They want to ban high-frequency trading, which is the use of sophisticated technological tools to trade securities like stocks or options, something that the normal stock trader or the normal individual doesn't have access to, and they consider that as a contributing factor in the flash crash event of May 6 of 2010. They want to see an arrest of the financial fraudsters responsible for the 2008 crash, and I know a lot of people lost a lot of money with that. They want presidential commission to investigate corruption in politics. And basically, these protesters want more and better jobs and a more equal distribution of income. So as I said to you, I'm challenging you to keep listening, because our conversation can get a little philosophical because my guest today is actually a professor of philosophy at DePaul University in Chicago. Welcome to Salinan, Professor Bill Martin. We welcome you to the Joan Jerkovich Show, Bill.
Thanks a lot.
Well, that was quite an introduction, which for my show is really a lot. But you have so much with the fact that you have authored 6 books on philosophy and social theory, and you right now are writing 2 currently, and you've also done some books on music. But the recent book that I was kind of looking at that I think can play into giving us some background and some history on what's happening with this Occupy movement is called Ethical Marxism, the Categorical Imperative of Liberation. And then I think it was volume 2 was Marxism and the Call of the Future, Conversations on Ethics, History, and Politics. So give us a definition of what ethical Marxism is.
It's very simple on one level and then very complicated on another, but I'm basically trying to bring together some themes from Karl Marx and Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher who made enormous contributions to philosophy, but one of them was to have an argument about ethics where he said that in a certain sense, the only way to talk about right and wrong is to actually talk about right and wrong, and don't talk about anything else such as happiness or pleasure, what one wants, what one's interests are. And this is a thought that's very difficult to incorporate into Marx's thinking, and what I tried to do is to do that, is to ask, what would it mean if an argument about economics and politics, which is generally what you find in Marx, had to have that as a starting point, this ethical moment where we talked about right and wrong in and of itself.
And it says, and I saw in one piece too where you wrote that ethical Marxism would say that capitalism is based on exploitation, and exploitation is wrong. Hence, here we are with the right and wrong discussion.
That's right, yeah. And one of the interesting things in Marx is that in some sense he doesn't want to use this language of right and wrong. He simply wants to say it's a historical development. It's one that had its day, should have had its day as the successor to feudal society, and then it will run its course, and then something else will emerge from it. And I certainly think that's true in one sense, in the sense that every form of society has its day. I mean, this is something people have a hard time accepting. They think that the thing that's here now has always been here and will always be here. But of course, if you look at history, that's not the case. So that's one level of analysis, but another level of analysis is to simply look at the ethical status of our social system. And it is based on exploitation, and that's not some sort of controversial claim. I mean, capitalists themselves don't argue otherwise. The labor that people do is simply one input to production. It's one thing among others to be considered in the production process. And so, now why is that exploitative? Because the other things that are put into the production process actually are things, but people are not things. Mm-hmm. And so capitalism makes of people things. And my argument is that is ethically wrong, and ethically it's an exploitative practice.
And you write about how capitalism is a process of generating surplus value, which means that actual living and breathing people are squeezed, and that this squeezing is wrong, morally wrong, and the people who do the squeezing are also wrong, or at least they're doing something wrong, and they should be stopped. And that's what you're talking about, you know, squeezing the people, squeezing those workers.
Well, that relates very directly to the Occupy
Absolutely.
Movement, because, I mean, now we have a very weird, interesting moment where somehow the definition of socialism is simply that you don't want millionaires and billionaires to have more money than they have already. And if you somehow have a problem with that, you're a socialist. Well, okay, fine. I mean, let's run with that. I don't want millionaires and billionaires to have more money than they have already. And so what's the process by which we say, you know, why is there an unequal distribution of wealth to such a huge extent to where they can even talk about the idea of the 1% and the 99%? And everybody knows it has some traction, that there's just an enormous disparity of wealth. And I will say, by the way, I mean, this goes not only against some sort of Marxist sense of things, but I mean, this goes against an early Christian sense of things. This goes against the civic republican tradition that draws its inspiration from Aristotle and that we see in the Renaissance. This goes against the ideas of Thomas Jefferson. The idea that you could have a society where clearly what we have is based on the work that people do, but somehow some people who purely by manipulating financial practices, and in the case of the current crisis, get involved in, you know, what are called exotic financial sort of practices, you know, weird things like naked short selling and whatnot,
right,
that don't have anything to do with any kind of production, and yet they have all the money, they have all the wealth, and they control all the wealth.
Yes, and
I mean,
there's no net value to a lot of that. Even this high frequency trading I was talking about, they cash out at the end of the day, and there's really no money transaction, yet they're hedging their bets and making money on these insider ways of trading, so to speak.
I mean, it's incredible. You don't have to be a Marxist or anything just to see that it's just crazy. It's an out of kilter, upside down society.
So what is your definition of socialism? Because that gets to be such a dirty word for some people, and I don't even think people understand it.
I think it's going to have to be redefined. I mean, I think it's going to have to be reinvented. I mean, we have the experience of the 20th century. I don't think it's all bad, but obviously it's not all good. It's a mixed bag. I frankly think there were some very good things, but of course there were some very bad things. But on another level, whatever that experience was, it's not necessarily the guide to what has to happen now. I mean, this also goes to the Occupy movement, that the Occupy movement is a strange thing for not only sort of the right wing, so to speak, to have to deal with, but for sort of the old left-wingers as well. They don't quite know what to do with it either, and people who are working with previous definitions are having a hard time knowing what to do. All they know to do is to bring their old ideas to it and say, why don't you guys get in gear with this, make some concrete demands, etc. And instead, the Occupy movement is something that just needs to breathe for a while and become something new, because that's what we need, is something new. So as far as defining socialism for now, or even communism for now, or even the alternative, I think we're in a space where it's going to be redefined, and that's, to me, is what's great about all of this.
And you know, as you mentioned redefining it, and as I try to get my head around some of these concepts, I'm almost feeling like not only do we maybe need to redefine it, we need to give it a new name. Because some of the names that we already have in place for this, has that ever been hypothesized with people that you write with and at the university there?
Yeah, I mean, this is a constant discussion, because the name of Marx, the words communism and socialism have been associated with some very bad things, especially in the 20th century. And yet at the same time, I wouldn't want to let go of those terms. I think what happens there is you sort of allow people who really want to shut these things down to define the terms for you. And at the same time, too, I mean, even while we need to invent something new, I don't want to get into the practice of sort of just disavowing previous experience. I think we have to own the previous experience and be responsible for it, and be responsible for looking at what were the bad things and even the worst things, and then taking them forward, correcting them, learning from them. So, and you can't learn from these things if you just say, oh, well, that wasn't us, we didn't have anything to do with that, in fact, we'll change the name of it and all of this. And so no, I want to hang on to this. And I also think the word communism now has a new resonance, and especially since people at first say, wait a minute, I don't know about that. I mean, Marx can be sort of just accepted as another guy we study at the university, as just somebody in a long line of thinkers. But communism sort of just shakes things up. And,
right. Scares people.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I actually wanted to use the word communism in the title of these books that you mentioned, but the publisher was scared of doing that too, and so we went with Marxism, and somehow that's sort of more acceptable in part because Marx is somebody in the scholarly canon, and people can just say, oh, a book about Marx. He was a German thinker in the 19th century.
Right, and Marx explained the general mechanism of regarding the control and the means of production to those that have the power and those that have the labor power to sell. So would his theories himself support the notion of capitalism exploiting this working class? I mean, I just don't think we understand his theories.
Well, I mean,
they don't seem so abstract and so out there when you try to read them and really take a look at them.
No, I mean, Marx is a very concrete thinker.
And some of his thinking that I was seeing might even support some of the Occupy movement.
I would
Is that
think,
a possibility?
although I think we have to be open to things, further developments in the theory that are so qualitatively different from where the theory started, that the originators of these theories, I mean Marx or Lenin for that matter, or earlier Marxist philosophers, themselves would be surprised and say, well, wait a minute, how does that have anything to do with what we were talking about? So I think there has to be an opening for discontinuity and something that's truly new, or otherwise there isn't real change. So, yeah, on the one hand, I mean, I think Marx, loved it when people rise up against the existing system. But on the other hand, whether he would really recognize something like Occupy or not, on some level, it's even beside the point.
True.
But Marx, I don't know if there was any other thinker besides Marx, any other philosopher in history of philosophy who said that he would be happy, in a certain sense, if all of his ideas had to be recast, as long as they were in the context of people changing the society to go beyond a society based on exploitation. I don't know any other philosopher who said that he was not attached to his own ideas, but what he was really attached to was the idea of changing the world.
And just what you said there, Bill, just to me speaks to what some of these people are trying to do. Change the society so that these people are not being exploited. And we're going to need to jump into a short break, but there's so much more that we're going to talk to about this Occupy movement. You're listening to Joan on the Joan Jerkovich Show, and again, go for video outtakes, podcasting, and a link to our iTunes at joanjerkovich.com. You're listening to the Joan Jerkovich Show, and I challenge you to come right back. We're on 910 KINA Salina. Paul, thanks for watching the time for me, because I really wasn't.
It's okay.
I think I'm going to go ahead and even just maybe let you run it the next time. What did I say for the next thing?
14, so
No,
we could do 13 and a half.
You took me all over my notes,
Oh, okay.
but that's perfect.
Are we doing all right? Is this
Very
okay?
good. Oh, absolutely. You're great.
Oh,
Why did I
okay,
lose my
good.
page? That has my times on it. That's what I need it for.
My mind is not as sharp as it might ordinarily be since the accident.
Well,
since
thank
I'm
goodness, because I can maybe keep
still
up with you a smidge,
I'm
just
still,
a smidge.
still on a lot of medications.
And we're still
stuff.
on video, you know, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Well, yeah, your big bicycle accident, that was pretty rough.
Yeah.
So,
Just
and.
make sure when you're reading your notes that you're still on the mic. 'Cause
Okay.
sometimes you.
I do.
Okay.
Okay, let me see. So we dabbled through several things. I'm trying to think, what do you think maybe that the people are gonna wanna listen to? I'd like to keep it real tied in. I'd like to talk a little more just about some of the issues of capitalism and competition.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we had some talk about ethics, we talked about socialism, and we're definitely gonna wanna touch at some point on the whole violence
Mm-hmm.
that you wrote about. I thought that was all pretty interesting
Mhm.
too. Oops,
Yeah, I'm glad you read that.
some of it. I haven't read any kind of an in-depth philosophy book for a long time.
And are we gonna talk about animals and vegetarianism?
You know, I think I just switched into, which I'd be happy to give you a voice for that, because I think that's real interesting. One of the reasons I switched was I was going to have a compliment who was also very strong on vegetarianism and hadn't been able to get a hold of them. But then I got reading some more of your book, and I saw where the Occupy movement was, a pretty hot topic too, and it
Mhm,
seems pretty
mhm.
related to.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, Paul, are you ready? Let's go back to another 14, and we'll see.
Okay.
See how we do. We're doing great. We're back after this short break, and this is Joan with the Joan Jerkovich Show. We're back talking to our philosopher, Bill Martin, and we've been talking about the Occupy movement. I know you've heard about Occupy Wall Street, and I want to get back to talking a little bit about capitalism with Dr. Martin here, because this is part of what some of the people that are protesting all over the nation are talking about. One of the things when he writes his book Ethical Marxism that I read was that Marx argues that the dirty little secret of capitalist exploitation is that the capitalists pay for labor power in the same way that they pay for all other inputs to production at the going rate, and which they say is the market rate. What do you have to say about that relative to the little guy?
I mean, on some level, to sort of go to the question of who are the 1%, so to speak, as the Occupy movement has put it, is that, one of Marx's great insights is that you don't need to use the language of good and evil or right and wrong to talk about capitalism. And I think, that goes contrary to what I said in the previous segment.
Absolutely, contrary to some of your philosophy.
Right, and I mean, on the one hand, I recognize that as a great insight. In other words, the way capitalism works is that it's a mechanism. And so when the capitalist is putting an enterprise together, now they have to have some previous store of wealth in order to do that, and the way that arose historically, and especially in what for Marx was the great laboratory of capitalism, which was England, was that basically the landed gentry, in a certain sense, moved into the city and set up the factory system. And then, the people on the land, the peasants, were replaced with sheep and weaving, and of course, the invention of the movable loom was really a big part of what got everything going, the steam engine, of course. But the point is, for Marx, the capitalist, in a certain sense, just goes down to the marketplace and purchases the inputs to labor, and that may mean bricks to build a factory, machines to use in the factory, and then labor to work in the factory. And Marx uses this interesting term. He doesn't say labor, he says labor power, the
Yes.
ability that people have to labor, which is different than, say, outright slavery, where you own the people. You don't own the people, you don't even own their labor, you rent it from them, so to speak.
Or buy it from them
Yeah, you buy it from them for a definite period of time.
at the going market rate.
Right.
Which isn't always a very livable income for a lot of the 99%.
Right, and at the going market rate, which of course now has become completely globalized, so you have corporations hopping from country to country to find the lowest possible rate. And now, of course, that means in the global economy that you do have people in countries like, say, Vietnam, which is an incredible irony that the US can produce all this stuff now in Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Southeast Asia generally, China generally, which is now truly the country of the working class, so to speak.
Yeah, I actually read that, where it's like the working class country of the world, because all these consumer goods have to be produced and processed somewhere. And like you
Right.
said, we're going where the cheapest place is.
Right, I mean, the great irony is that under Mao, in a certain sense, it was the proletarian socialist country based on the peasantry mainly, but now it is the country of the working class that's producing all the stuff that we buy at
So are
the
we
big
just
box
calling them
stores.
working class instead of proletarian socialists?
Well, I'm just saying that's where all the
Right.
working is going on. That's where, and not all, I should say that. And the U.S.
Of course.
has a sizable working class and all of that. In fact, that's something we can't ever mention. You'll hardly ever hear a politician use the term working class. They'll say middle class, but of course there are many working class people in the United States.
Well,
But-
and when they talk about the loss of our middle class, that 99% are almost all becoming working class.
At best, yes.
If we lose that middle class the politicians like to talk about.
At best, I mean, and there's a lot of different directions we can go with that. But just to go back to the earlier point, the point is the capitalist goes down to the marketplace and buys the inputs of production and buys labor along with everything else. And that in itself, for Marx, is not evil, or the language of talking about good and evil isn't the right language for talking about that, because in a certain sense, they're just innocently going down and buying the inputs of production. It just turns out that all the other inputs of production, such as the bricks and the machines and whatnot, themselves were created through a labor process. So labor created all the other inputs, and the point is, you can then buy labor in the marketplace as if it's something that was already fully congealed, so to speak, but it's the gift that keeps on giving. It gives more than what is required to buy it. And the capitalist basically scoops off that more, and that's where profit comes from. And the point is that you then get to this point, and I think this is key to Occupy. What are these people in the 1% doing? What is their contribution exactly, other than actually to immiserate other people? Maybe not the 99%, but even if it's the 35% or whatever, but it's pushing people down. That's their contribution, is just to push people down. And they're superfluous. Marx says at a certain point, that upper crust that all they do is own stuff and manipulate numbers for their own benefit, they're superfluous. We don't need them. So let's get rid of them.
Well, and to add to what you're saying there, talking about pushing people down, that 1%, or manipulating people, let's talk about the consciousness business that you talk about, where capitalists will take the working people and they will not have a level playing field because they go into the business of creating what forms of consciousness, getting them to believe and undermine, maybe sometimes you write through mindless distraction, to basically keep them in that working class. It's almost like, some kind of a propaganda scheme.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Am I getting a little reactive here?
no, I mean, it's deeper than propaganda. It's more brilliant. It's more brilliant than propaganda. It's very
Wow.
brilliant. The consciousness business. I mean, I wrote about
In fact,
this.
when you wrote about that, I almost thought, listen, Bill, if somebody hasn't really consciously thought of that, don't give them that information. That's what I thought. But yeah, it's being done regardless. So it's brilliant. Tell us about the brilliance of it.
Well, I mean, it's beyond anything Marx could have imagined, really. I mean, for Marx, the people who own the means of production also own the means of creating ideology and disseminating information. They own newspapers and whatnot. And I remember...
I'm getting this chill of communism or something. Am I the wrong definition here?
Well, I mean...
Or Hitler, throwing the pamphlets out of the aircraft that just inundated the city?
Yeah, but the point is that was rather crude, extremely crude compared to what the way the consciousness business works in our more advanced capitalist society, where you can get Tea Party people who are often made up of people from the working class and from the lower middle class who think that it's in their interest that millionaires and billionaires have more money. That's a fascinating sort of thing. I think one of the greatest critiques of that, by the way, is in the Monty Python film Life of Brian. I don't know if your listeners or if
There
you've
weren't
seen
tea parties back then, were there?
Yeah, there were, because they're represented by the guy who's in the dungeon, who's hanging upside down with the beard that's down to his knees, talking about how the Romans are a bloody great race of people, and see that scene if you have it, but it's a very similar sort of phenomenon.
Hence the brilliance of what they're doing, kind of under the radar, so to speak, certainly under the radar of the consciousness of a lot of these working people, as you mentioned, even who are in something like the Tea Party movement.
Well, or Newt Gingrich saying, for example, that child labor laws are stupid, and that poor kids who are in elementary and junior high schools should be put to work as sort of assistant janitors in those schools. Well, I mean, on the one hand, I don't see anything wrong with young people engaging in productive labor along with their schooling, as long as we're all doing it. Philosophers for that matter too, pitching in and doing a little, manual work as well. But if we're all doing
democracy, that idea that Gingrich proposed isn't a democracy, what would you call it? Is it more socialistic?
I would just call it
pitching?
I would call it pushing people down. I would call it saying, in a certain sense, in a very direct way, what is the reality of our society, which is that class mobility is not what it's cracked up to be. Most people remain in the class that they're born in, although we're now at a point where people, if they have class mobility at all, it's downward.
And I have to ask, I want to talk a little bit about class, as you write in your book, about class as related to capitalism and competition, because we like the notion of competition, and we like to think that we're all on a playing field, but the classes that we do have don't keep us or put us on a playing field. One from an upper class might have more training, more education, maybe more encouragement, and again, this just separates the classes in our own country here.
Well, maybe I'll tell this goes to something you said you wanted to talk about anyway, which is violence. But
yes.
Let me tell you my favorite joke about capitalism. There was a miner in England, a coal miner, who was walking home from a long day at the mines, and he decided to take a shortcut across a field. And he's going across the field, and a guy rides up on a horse and said, "This is private property, you need to get off of this field." And the miner says, "Well, how did you come by it?" And the guy says, "My great-grandfather won it in a battle." And the miner says, "Well, get off your horse and take off your coat and I'll fight you for it right now."
I love that.
And,
I love that.
you know, that goes to the roots of where, you know, how all this starts. It starts in enormous violence. It starts in
Yes.
moving people off the land, and it has a history.
Well, and when I talked about competition, I thought it was real interesting that you wrote that the ruling class, let's call them, and their political conception is that they do value and hold dear competition, but they hold even more dear their private property and the ownership of that property. So let's take up our swords and fight for it.
Right, and I mean, you know, one of the things I get into in my ethical Marxism book is the question of agriculture, which I think is another missing chapter in Marxist thought and in most Marxist thought. I mean, one of my aims in the book was to sort of, in a certain sense, supply missing chapters to the history of Marxism and things that hadn't been thought about very much. And when you look at a traditional farming society, traditional agrarian society, competition is not the thing that rules the society. In other words, the aim is not to own your neighbor's farm, so to speak. The aim is to farm productively and sustainably and to sustain yourself. And on the whole, it's outside of a money economy. It's when the money economy comes in that all of a sudden you start to get exploitation. Even the early Marx said you start to get money as a thing in itself. You get the need for money, and you know that's the thing that we should think of as weird. This, in a way, is the brilliance of what of the consciousness business. The idea that actually people could believe in the need for money as opposed to the need for the basic things that are necessary for life.
And boy, we're getting into a big subject there, materialism. And maybe we can touch on that with you a little bit when we get back, Bill, but we're back to having to take a little bit of a break. And again, I'm challenging my listeners. This is pretty interesting stuff, a little philosophical. I promise you that I'm going to give you a little information sometimes, and this is the show for that. So stay tuned with Joan. This is the Joan Jerkovich Show on 910 KINA Salinan.
Okay.
Is this all right?
Oh, you're doing great.
This is good.
I could just sit and listen to you all day. I can see Paul's over there kind of, yeah, that's interesting stuff. Do we get college credit, Bill, for this? I swear I should. Oh.
No, you have to do some exams and whatnot if you want college credit.
I know. I have to actually
Yeah.
officially go
I
to
have to-
class and all that kind of
To
stuff.
find out what you're doing with the material, so to
I
speak.
know. You're just a consummate
You know,
professor here.
I got college credit for it, you know.
Yeah. That's right. Well, I'm gonna, honestly, I wanna, I know we talked about materialism in that break there, but where would you go with materialism if we wanna go back to that? Otherwise, I want to talk at some point about, do you consider this Occupy movement what you call an actual revolutionary movement?
Yeah,
And you talk about the learning curve of revolution.
wanna
I'd
talk
kind of
about
like to
that.
go there.
yeah, I want to
We're
talk
okay
about
for that?
that.
Okay, let's try that for this segment. I'm feeling that.
Okay, okay.
This is sort of by the seat of our pants, you can tell.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good.
It's a free
Some
flow.
of it's coming back to me, so to speak.
Darn, you're doing pretty good.
Because, like
You
I
must
say,
not have taken your meds today.
I'm way into the other books.
Yeah, I know.
But one of them is the continuation of this, so.
Okay, yeah. So, okay, well, Paul, we're gonna
Okay.
do, what are we gonna do?
8 minutes?
Okay, and then is it 7?
Uh-huh.
Because I keep throwing my papers away that I'm done with, so.
And we were half a minute short last time and half
Okay.
over the first, so
Okay, we're good.
we're good.
Get my buttons right here. A big thanks to my listeners taking my challenge for staying tuned into the Joan Jerkovich Show here on 910 KINA. We're still here with Professor Bill Martin talking about the Occupy movement. He is a philosophy professor, and so this is a little bit about philosophy. and his book on ethical Marxism. But I want to ask him about, he talks about the revolutionary movement, maybe the need for a revolutionary movement to change some of the aspects that are happening in society, maybe to keep that 99% beat down. And would you consider, Dr. Martin, in regards to the Occupy movement, would you actually call this movement a revolutionary movement?
You know, we don't know what it is yet. I mean,
Yeah.
it might be, it might not be. You know, we don't know what it will become. That's what's great about it. And I think in a way, for now, the thing is to keep that space open to where it could become that. But without sort of thinking there's some guarantee of anything, because one thing we know is that there are no guarantees of anything. I mean, in fact, one of the trends in Marx's thought, and in Marx's thought, I try to go against very strongly as a kind of inevitabilist idea that somehow it's inevitable that society's going to go one way or another. We just can't say that anymore. In a certain sense, in Marx, that's a kind of hangover from Christianity, the idea that it's all going to work out in a certain direction. And I think even for the early Christians, when they would express a kind of inevitable sense of that, it was also a kind of audacity, because they were in the face of a massive empire, the Roman Empire. And so when we say, you know, well, we will win, or it will become this, I think that's more of the expression of what we hope will happen, which is absolutely necessary to something happening. But I don't think we know what it's going to be. I think, you know, one of the interesting things in the early part of the Occupy movement was that, like you said, it sort of started from this call from Adbusters magazine, but they had a certain conception of what it would be, which is not what it's turned out to be. I mean, they thought it would be something that would express these very concrete demands. And then it started with a certain number of people, and then it sort of started to dwindle away. And then it was when the police moved in and did some outrageous things like pepper spraying people in the face. And then, like you said, through social media, the outrage of that, then suddenly it grew and then started growing. But at first it didn't just grow and grow and grow and grow. It wasn't just an upward swing. And so then it became something else. It really started to say, well, look, we're up against we're up against the establishment, as we used to say back in the 60s. And it just grew around many, many different issues, and people were saying, well, what are your demands? What do you really want? And then there was this brilliant sort of thing coming from it to, in a certain sense, resist the demand for demands. And to just say, well, in a certain sense...
Oh, that's going to go everywhere with the establishment.
Right, well, in a certain sense, and this scares the establishment, well, our demand is for everything. Our demand is that the whole setup is messed up. And as far as what it's going to take to change that, well, we don't know right now.
And the demands are kind of broad, and we're a little difficult for me to even kind of poke through the literature to see and try and really find out. But I think part of the issue that a lot of this movement is having trouble with is getting those demands clearly defined and clearly expressed.
Yeah, but that, again...
But you're saying that's okay?
That's great, actually. It's more than okay. It's great because it's on the edge of something. And what it will have to become as for example, they get into more confrontations with power, so to speak, we'll see. In a certain sense, too, just strategically, just to think in that kind of way, it could actually be to the benefit of Occupy that the police shut it down at a certain point, because then they don't have to confront the question of how to sleep in a tent in the middle of the winter in New York City or Chicago.
Well, I was in Denver. It was so darn cold, I couldn't believe they were out there in tents, much less.
Right.
You know.
So in a certain sense, now the question is, what will the spring bring? But of course, spring is a time for renewal, and I would say the powers that be ought to worry. Let me put it that way.
And you talk about worrying. We have seen some situations with the pepper spraying of protesters, some violence that might be breaking out. And you do write about the fact that you wrote that underlying our complex social and political structure are not only arguments about fairness, rising tides, or property rights, but about enforcement And that's what it brings us to violence. How do enforcement and violence factor in to, let's just call it, this movement?
Well, I think it's something that the movement's going to have to learn how to confront, and it'll learn as as Lenin put it, defeated armies learn well.
Is that a necessary part of change?
I think so. I mean, I'll just
Shake
bite
it
the
up,
bullet.
wake it up.
Well,
you know.
let me put it this way. On the other side, when Chairman Mao said political power flows out the barrel of a gun, he didn't mainly mean the side that was resisting. He meant the side that was holding on to power. That they would use every gun at their disposal to hold on to the power that they have, and you'll have to find a way to deal with that.
We are seeing that in action right now.
Yeah, and so what that will be in the coming time.
The 1% are gonna, I guarantee you, hold on with everything they've got.
Well, yeah, that's right. And in a certain sense, that's the definition of conservatism, that they believe that by right they have what they have, almost in a kind of God-given way, and they'll do whatever it takes to hang on to it. And so how to confront that, given that they've got some big guns, they've got some big ideological guns, that's what's going to have to be grappled with in the coming period of Occupy.
Yeah, a lot of complexity to the Occupy movement that's, of course, taking place nationwide. And we're back to taking another break with Joan on the Joan Jerkovich Show. And be sure to catch Bill and I on the video outtakes. Go to podcasting and links to my iTunes and my blogs on joanjerkovich.com. We'll be right back. You're listening to 910 KINA Salinan. Beep.
See how I got Lenin and Mao in there?
Yeah. You know, we're Fox News. Did you see that sign over this Fox
Yeah, no,
News?
I know. Yeah,
Like,
no, I know.
oh
I
my
see
gosh,
it right
I'm gonna
there,
get
too.
kicked out of here.
I hope
I
not.
just carried your book, Ethical Marxism, and I was waiting for you up at the front desk, and and Jerry Henriquez, where he stands. I don't know if you ever listened.
Yeah, no, I know.
You wouldn't listen to his
No,
show
no.
probably.
No, I know a little bit.
Except to call in a bit and argue with him. But what did he say? He goes, you know what they say? First there's capitalism, then there's socialism, then there's Marxism. So have you heard that before? I hadn't.
Well,
We don't know. Jerry might have just made that
well,
up.
like who says?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, Marx says that, yeah.
okay, like who says that?
Well, I mean, first there's primitive communal society, then there's slavery, then there's feudalism,
okay.
then,
Yeah.
that's
Throw-
Marx's,
Okay,
that's Marx's scheme.
okay,
Then there's capitalism, socialism, and communism, yeah.
okay, yeah.
And then who knows what beyond that.
Do we even dare talk about communism and why people fear communism? This is our last chance.
Well, I thought we said a little bit about that already.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can talk about, whatever you want to talk about.
vegetarianism. Just
Yeah, you would like to talk about that.
I would like to talk about the animal question a little bit.
Okay, let's
How
go
can we
there.
transfer into that?
No, let me just kind of
Well,
review my notes.
I think the question of violence actually,
That's exactly
can-
what I was
There you
thinking.
go.
That's exactly where I was at looking at this. What is that radical project? Is that your concept?
my book called that, you mean? or-
Okay, but is it a project or is it your book? Here's what it says.
I wrote a book called The Radical
As a
Project.
contribution to the radical project. Okay, you meant as a contribution to your book.
No, I meant as a contribution to changing the world.
Okay.
The
Yeah.
Radical Project, changing the world in the image of a good society that's
Mhm.
not based on exploitation,
Mhm.
domination,
Wow.
hierarchies.
I think you need to talk about that. I want to hear your thoughts on that, and then let's get into, violence with animals. I can't say I agree with that, but I'll listen.
Well,
I'm a meat eater.
it
I'm
could
a
go the
carnivore.
other way. It could go the other way too. I mean,
Uh-huh.
I think the way people learn to accept cruelty in the world is at the dinner table. Because children always ask, well,
Yeah.
why are we eating these
Yeah.
animals?
Yeah.
And then the answer is, I worked hard to put this on the table, and
Mhm.
that's the way it is. Why do
Mhm.
we have to do that? That's the way it is. Which is always the last refuge of someone who doesn't have an argument for something.
Yeah, but also in our society, in our cities, kids don't understand that you don't get that animal product outside of the grocery store.
That's right, yeah.
And I'm gonna tell a little story about that, because I've had firsthand with some of that, and so we'll talk about that.
Okay, okay.
Sometimes I don't like to talk too much about it, or we'll think we've said it all, and then we get on the air and we forget we need to talk about it again.
Right.
You have almost 8 minutes,
Okay.
because you were just barely
Yeah, sometimes
over.
it's just coming to a closing thought, and we're
Yeah,
good.
okay.
So that's it, right, these last 8
Yep.
minutes.
Yeah,
All
it
right.
goes fast.
Wow.
I almost do
I
2
know.
shows.
I know, I actually,
Or
when I was
100.
doing all this prep, I thought, geez, I've got 2 shows worth here.
Okay, I put my headphones
Welcome back, listeners. This is Joan with the Joan Jerkovich Show on 910 KINA Salina. We're wrapping up our conversation about the Occupy movement here with Bill Martin, our philosopher. And I can't let him get out of the office without talking to us about 2 things at least. And one is he wrote a book about the Radical Project and how that's going to change and transform the world. And I also want to talk to him about being a vegetarian. So let's talk about how you see the Radical Project changing the world. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Occupy, again, is a good place to start with that, and this idea that a kind of refusal of the way things are. As far as the way things ought to be, I mean, that's what people have to invent. It can't just be some sort of blueprint in somebody's mind in advance of that. But again, that's what I find inspiring about Occupy, because it opens this space for that that kind of thinking that things could be different.
And we talked a little bit about violence too. Where does this fit into the equation? You know, how sometimes things don't change unless there's an element of violence, and then that goes into what you talked about of animal rights.
Well, I mean, I think the system itself is so extraordinarily violent that, you know, my big worry is that if there's going to be a changed society, it's going to be somehow picking up out of some sort of an enormous pile of rubble after a fantastic amount of death and destruction. And unfortunately, that's the way it's been in revolutions in the past. And I don't know, I mean, the dynamics of society now are geared to where they could create such a huge pile of rubble that there's no digging out from under it. That's the worry. But I mean, violence is always initiated by the existing system, and so in a certain sense, all revolutionary violence is defensive, or it begins in that defensive way. It's a little bit like playing the black position in chess, that you go second, and so you're at a weakness to begin with, and then what you have to do is to try to equalize before you can go on the offensive, and I think that's sort of how that works, just strategically. It's too bad, obviously, it's too bad the world is such that, you know, we have to do this. And I mean, I know for myself, I'm kind of a sentimental person, and I don't like sort of hating on things and that sort of thing, but that's the society that we have.
And does it go into what you talked about in our first segment about kind of this right and wrong? What's right and what's wrong? Is it right for this 1% to have so much and this 99% to have so little? Does it take some kind of element of violence to actually see or make change? Or maybe just being so downtrodden that at some point, you know, there is going to be an uprising. Is that what the Occupy movement might be about? We're tired of this.
Well, I mean, you know, it's interesting, the Occupy movement right now is mainly made up of people, well, all kinds of people, but a lot of them are professionals or semi-professional people, but who don't have any jobs right now. And joblessness, and especially among young people who are just getting out of college, is this huge thing. And you see that in other moments when there's a lot of change, especially I think in Latin America and in the Arab Spring from this last year, that you have a lot of people who are lawyers who don't have clients, teachers who don't have students to teach, etc., that strata of people. And it's not yet, in a certain sense, bolstered by the people who are really at the bottom edge of life, who are being, having trouble just holding body and soul together. And I think Marx is right about the idea that you'll really get an impetus toward really radical change when that part of society comes into play. And so we haven't seen that yet, and I don't know what that'll look like in our present circumstances, but I think that's where things will get a great deal more intense.
So Bill, as a philosopher, I know you want to have a little time, and we're going to have to close shortly. We have a little time, though, to ask you your thinking and your philosophy on being a vegetarian.
Right. I mean, I think this is an enormous violence, but it's also where we learn to accept cruelty as just the norm of society. It's where boys learn to be men in an ugly way. It's where we just learn that these horrors of what I call the industrial food animal production system should just be accepted as just the way things work, and there's no necessity for it. It's just pure ugliness and horrible violence and horrible cruelty that has just no justification whatsoever. And so the fact that it exists and we just take it to be the way things work does play into also our larger understanding of the way society works.
So are you mostly pointing a finger at the industrial production of meat and those foods? Because I grew up on a farm and we literally butchered our own meat. And I can't say, when you have city kids who think that everything that's put on the table comes from the grocery store, they don't even have a concept of what I saw. And I remember one of the most profound moments of my life as a little girl. I could have been 8 years old, 9 years old, when it was butchering day, and I was always very excited about that, but I had never gone down to the pen and watched my dad shoot the animal. And I literally, it was so affecting, I literally almost passed out. Because, it was a cold day, and, the shot of the animal, radiated out into the cold air with the steam, and I'm like, oh my gosh. That's not what I'm seeing when they've already got it, quartered and skinned and up at the house. So, it was kind of an interesting thing, but yet, growing up on a farm, I didn't see that as inhumane. That was the way we fed our family. Is it more the industrialized production that you're concerned about?
I mean, the industrialized production is phenomenally inhumane and phenomenally cruel. As far as people growing up on farms or people in third world countries that are primarily agricultural, well, I also just don't think there's a necessity for it, but I do recognize that things would have to be organized quite differently and basically outside of a money economy for that to work for those people. But yeah, mainly that industrial system that is really not only at the core of a certain kind of ugliness and violence, but of a thingification of living sentient creatures who do have feelings and who can suffer and who do suffer enormously. And just to point to one example, I mean, the chicken is probably the most abused animal on our planet, and it's just horrible. And that's the animal, I think, where a lot of children realize suddenly that what they're eating is an animal, because you realize, wait, I'm eating the leg of something, I'm eating the wing of something.
Mm-hmm.
And then children quite often are repulsed by that, and then enormous resources go into convincing the child that no, this is necessary, this is the way it works. Just eat your chicken and shut up. Don't reject that. And then I'm interested in everything else that goes with that. How we just learn that, well, cruelty is just the way society works, the way things work in our world. Learn to live with it.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to say in closing here, Bill?
Well, thanks for it's it's pretty neat to have this discussion, and I do reside in Salina as well, and so I'm very appreciative to be able to have this discussion here and not only in Chicago.
Well, and I appreciate you so much coming on, and thank you so much. I'm not beyond pimping out my husband any opportunity I get to get good intellectual guests on, because it's always his connections that challenge me with my interviews. So thanks to all my listeners, too, for staying on listening to Joan with the Joan Jerkovich Show. And be sure to go to joanjerkovich.com for the video outtakes, links to iTunes, and my blog. Thanks for joining us for innovative talk radio that surprises, entertains, and certainly today informed you. The Joan Jerkovich Show, 9 a.m. Saturdays on 910 KINA Salina. Did we go over just a little bit, Paul?
Like a minute.
Okay, we'll work that out. Well, yeah, and I'm glad we mentioned too at the end there that you are from Salina, because the way your introduction is, we know you, and I know on your Facebook you show that you live in Chicago, but you know, my other son, this is my son here, and my other son has been a vegetarian for, oh gosh, since he's in high school, 15 years.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, and he has a lot of what you said about the treatment of animals, but also the environment. And you wrote some about how a lot of your issues come back to the environment relative to treating animals, but also this capitalistic society that we didn't get into was talking about we all have this ownership. We talked about the ownership of property. So, okay, it's mine, I own it, I can destroy it if I want, with no sense of right or wrong for the greater conscious of the world.
There was a great Calvin and Hobbes cartoon years ago, and I brought it in when I used to teach business ethics sometime. It's basically some giant flying saucer has shown up and sticking the equivalent of a huge straw into the ocean. It's just going to suck up the whole ocean. And people are saying, well, we need that water, and the aliens are saying, well, that's too bad. We're in a position to take it.
Yeah.
And that's all there really is to it.
We're the 1% from outer space.
In a certain sense, what answer does humanity have to that? I mean, that's how we do it.
Exactly.
If you can take it, then, you know, if you can put a fence around it, then, you know, then you can do what you want with it. And it'd be interesting to debate this too with a sort of an Ayn Rand kind of orientation person. I don't know if some of your people here have that orientation, but it's sort of making a resurgence.
I have some friends that,
Explain that to me. You lost me.
Well,
she's very like, she just kind of believes, it almost is like the extreme capitalism, like,
oh, I did see something.
Am I right?
Yeah, well, if you own something, then that even includes the right to destroy it.
Exactly. Yeah.
That was where I read.
And you know, what an ugly conception of ownership. For one thing, ownership means, what did you do to make something your own?
She seems like a bitter person.
She was a bitter person. Her, you know, she's fascinating really, because her whole philosophy is based on the idea of individual happiness, that my own happiness is the highest goal, and you know, nothing should get in the way of my pursuit of that. You know, other than if I'm somehow trying to take away your right to pursue that as well. But she was a deeply unhappy person, and she made people around her miserable too, to the point where some of them committed suicide, for that matter.
Really?
Because she had sort of an inner circle, you know, like Alan Greenspan was part of her inner circle at one point. And you know, she had a little cult around herself, basically, and and she was miserable for some reasons that I'm sympathetic to. I mean, she had, for example, she had deep insecurity about sort of body image, which is something a lot of women have, and lately even more and more men. And so she was always on. She was always chirpy and always talking. But one reason is that she just ate diet pills, you know, speed. Just sort of,
she was on amphetamines.
Pretty much all the time. Like Nancy Reagan, actually. Like, just say no to drugs, Nancy Reagan. That's why she's so chirpy, and also why she's just this tiny,
I guess I never knew that about her. I should have.
Bird-boned,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, exactly.
That's almost a little Reaganomics, what she kind of I guess a little bit from what I know.
And we know
Right.
Nancy had a lot of influence on Ronald Reagan, especially in the later years when he
Oh,
had
right.
Alzheimer's when
Like
he was
the-
still in office. I
right.
mean, that's pretty.
Somehow
Like
he
the
was
like the
functioning.
trickle
Yeah.
down, like
Yeah.
we'll take it all, you know,
Mhm.
because it's our right, and then
Mhm.
they can have
Mhm.
it. So
All right.
Although even Reagan thought that taxes should be raised on millionaires.
Mhm.
You know, there's this quotation going around now where it says that millionaires should pay their fair share. And they don't
The
tell you
Robin
who
Hood
said
tax.
it. And it was something that Ronald Reagan said just before he raised taxes in the early 80s, you know. So even he wasn't arguing that there's no other purpose to the economy than that just wealth should just flow up and up and up and up and up and make these people. Now, I mean, there's a mechanism.
Do you believe what Marx thought, though, that at some point capitalism would just have a natural evolution to socialism? In a sense, it would correct itself?
No.
I mean, he did believe that, at least from someone of what I
Yeah.
wrote in your book, read in
He
your
did, but he also thought that that was because, in a certain sense, it was like a chemical reaction within a
book.
container.
Mhm.
And the container was, in a certain sense, the borders of a country.
Right.
And so the
Self-contained,
so
we're
the-
not self-contained.
yeah, the
Yeah.
bourgeoisie of a country would be confronted by the proletariat of that country. And that was maybe more true in his time.
True.
But it's just not true anymore. And in fact, it actually does go to the point that these millionaires and billionaires, it's not simply greed. It's that they are competing in a global marketplace. And so it's not just that they should get richer and richer. I mean, the Republican Party exists on the basis of the idea that they should get richer and richer. That's all they've got as a program anymore. I mean, the actual capitalists, the actual owners of the means of production, and the owners of the financial apparatus, which is what's, you know, really driving everything now.
It really is.
I mean, they have to compete on a global
Yes,
scale.
they do.
And they do. And so if they ruin not just the lives, but even the economic structure of the United States, well, that's just doing business for
To
them.
them.
So if they move manufacturing, I mean, the United States is still, there's a myth that the U.S. doesn't produce anything anymore. That's not true. It produces something like 27-28% of the world's manufactured goods. And so it's not that all production has now moved to Latin America and Southeast Asia and China and whatnot. That's not entirely true, but a lot of it has. A lot of these companies, you know, we think of as being
American made.
the great American
They have like
companies.
one little piece of something so that they can call it American made.
Yeah, like
I've heard that.
like Maytag washing
Mhm.
machines or whatever.
Mhm.
That's gone now.
Maybe
Or
they make the knobs in the U.S.
I saw this. I actually watched this
Assembled
YouTube
in the U.S.
video of this guy who I admire a lot. I'd never seen him. I didn't know what he looked like or anything. I'd never seen him on video before. But this guy Paul Craig Roberts. Do you know him?
No, I've not heard of this. What is this?
Well, he was the under assistant of the Treasury, Secretary of the Treasury under Ronald Reagan. And he's now gone in a completely different direction. But he has a lot of credibility because he's got a PhD in economics and I believe, or public finance or something like that. And he was talking about this drone that was brought down in Iran. Do you know about this? You know, the U.S. was flying one of these drones, and Iranian computer scientists hacked into the drone and made it land in Iran. And so they have captured this drone aircraft, which is highly advanced technology,
Right.
and completely undamaged. You know, it wasn't like it was shot down. They just hacked into it and told it to land. And now they have it. They've been showing it, you know, look what we got now. And Paul Craig Roberts was being interviewed about this, and he said, well, maybe that's because parts of the drone were made in China. And why would the Chinese want the U.S. to have military technology?
And why would they protect our intellectual property?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And,
well, the funny part is
that
they're
mayor-
scared that they're
How
going
would
to
it
sell the
not-
information
how
back
would-
to China.
how would it
so
not leak out?
right.
Yeah.
And
they probably are.
that may or may not be
Finders
true,
keeper.
be true.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that the U.S. is now a power that even its military equipment is built in other
Yeah.
countries.
Which is a threat to security.
You would
really?
think, yeah,
You would
and
think.
so which on one level is fine with me.
Yeah.
You know, being an anti-system.
Why do we need these fighting machines anyway?
Well, yeah, all that too,
Mhm.
but yeah.
Well, you know, people say, of course, for protection, but
I mean, that goes to another issue, you know, that people, this competition cooperation thing. I mean, capitalism globally requires cooperation on a scale that Marx couldn't have imagined.
Mhm.
It requires economic planning
right.
on a, you know, people say, well, Marx wants a planned economy. Well, what do you think the global capitalist economy now is? It's
Mhm.
planned on a scale. I mean, General Motors has to plan, and General Electric has to plan on a scale that's far beyond that of most countries in the world.
Yes,
Mm.
absolutely.
It's vastly planned beyond.
Yes, they
Marx
are.
could not have imagined.
They're bigger
that-
than many countries.
That's why all these, you know,
Mhm.
50
These big
or more year old,
corporations.
you know, ideals and ideas of what the government should be are, like you were saying, just kind of a little bit defunct right now
Need
because
to be redefined.
they're so centralized in, you know, England or whatever the developing country was, or even the US back then, you know, so
Right.
I think, you know,
Right.
they have to come up with something new, and maybe that's what this Occupy
What is
movement
this
could be trying to do. I don't know.
emancipatory process that your contemporary philosopher Derrida, did I say that
Mhm,
correct?
mhm.
What is that? He's talking about that as far as something that relative to Marx, emancipatory promise of Marx.
Right.
What
I
is
mean,
that?
Jacques Derrida was a, you know, French philosopher who died in October, I think it was,
Of
of
04.
2004, born in 1930 in Algeria. Like a lot of French philosophers, he wasn't from France.
Mm.
His parents, I believe, were Romanian Jews who, I think his parents grew up in Algeria, but their parents, I think, came from Romania. He wrote a book called Spectres of Marx, where he finally sort of dealt with Marx a little more head-on than he had in the past. Because it seems like his philosophy had sort of a radical orientation, and he would mention Marx here and there, but he hadn't really discussed Marx openly. And I think part of that is that he doesn't really want to take on what you might call the more mechanistic aspects of Marx, like the idea that, like you say, that socialism will somehow naturally
Mhm.
evolve from capitalism. But what he does want to hold forth is that what Marx was dedicated to was this idea of that there's the promise of emancipation, which means that it's there as a possibility, but it has to be fulfilled. You know, like Derrida will say things like a promise has to promise to be kept. You know, it can't just be something you say lightly, so to speak. But as to whether that will absolutely happen or not, there's no way. It's a world of contingency. It's not a world of necessity, as Marx tended to think. And so what does that promise mean in a world of contingency? And you see that a lot in French philosophy, actually, the need to come to terms with contingency rather than necessity.
I saw you dedicated, or you had a memoriam to him in your book,
Yeah, I
too.
studied
You
with
studied with
Professor
him.
Derrida, and he was a lovely man. I mean, he was very kind and generous, and
Where did you study with him at?
well, I
Where-
started working on his work as part of my graduate work, and then I ultimately wrote my dissertation about him, and then that became my first book. But I went to a summer school for basically literary theory at the school of what's called the School of Criticism and Theory, which at that point was at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. So I spent the summer sort of listening to and talking with Professor Derrida, and
So So he was affiliated with Dartmouth, and
Well,
or was he just a guest
he was-
professor or something?
well, everyone there is a guest professor.
Oh,
I mean,
I
it's like
see.
a summer institute.
Oh, I see, it's a summer
I
institute.
mean, his affiliations were in Paris, really,
Mhm.
at the
Mhm.
École Normale Supérieure, and then later at what was the place called? I want to say, the Advanced School for the Social Sciences is what it would be in English.
Mhm.
And actually I've only been in Paris a couple times, but one time I went, this was after he died, but I went to look at the school where he taught, and I was surprised, not entirely surprised, that the building and the office weren't really as nice as the one I have, so.
Oh, wow.
Even though he was
yeah.
probably, in his time, the most
Oh,
famous
yeah.
philosopher.
I was gonna say, he's written so much and
Well, and he's somebody who was
so many
even
publications.
denounced on the floor of Congress
Oh.
back in the early '90s when people were talking about multiculturalism and diversity, and talking about Derrida as being an inspiration for that, and he would be denounced as somebody in favor of cultural relativism and stuff like that. And so I think even some congressperson denounced him in the U.S. Congress, which is always good, I think.
Yeah,
you know?
get your name out there.
Yeah.
Now they
Yeah.
know about you.
Yeah, I remember a friend of mine, Diana Fuss, who teaches at Princeton. She was actually, I know her from that school. One of her books was attacked by in print by Camille Paglia, or Paglia, as some people say. And she was telling me about it, sort of complaining about it. I said, "This is the best thing that could ever happen, you know?
Exactly.
This is great."
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah, to be attacked is good, actually, by the right people.
Well, maybe we'll get a little piece of that with you talking about Marxism and communism and Maoism and all of this on Fox News. You and I'll both get out there.
That would be fun. You think so?
But
I can
who
go that way.
knows? You know.
Yeah,
who
people
knows?
say, well, in
I hope
Joan,
you
well, they say
share.
that in Joan's show the other day, they were doing this. I mean, does that happen?
Yeah, people talk. Yeah,
I
they
mean,
do.
on the other programs.
Yes, they do.
Oh, okay, good.
Yes, they do. And
Good.
I will tease Jerry right before we put your show up, which is actually going to come up, after the first year because we're recording this. I will give him some teasers and hope that he will talk about it on his show.
good.
But, yours is very much the kind of thing that he likes to banter about.
Right,
Because
right,
a lot of my shows aren't very political.
right.
I really stretched him a bit when I wanted him to promo my transgender guest. He wasn't feeling that one, but this one he will. I'm sure he'll be all over
yeah.
this.
I mean, the gay fashion stuff I'd be happy to talk about. too.
Yeah, I've had some guys that have even said, "I want to be on your show." Well, are you willing to come and drag? Just teasing, because my show's kind of all over the board. It's a lot of fun.
What is
So
drag?
how does a guy
What
with
is drag? Everything is drag.
Everything anymore.
Everyone's presenting in one way or another.
So how does a guy with your religious predilection or non-predilection get to be teaching at the biggest Catholic university in the nation?
Because it's not very Catholic. In that,
Okay,
well, in
spill
that
the beans.
respect, I mean, it's not ideologically Catholic
Okay.
among the faculty. It
Oh.
is Catholic
Yeah.
in many what I would think of as good senses, in that the guiding spirit is Saint Vincent de Paul, who basically was someone who tried to do good works and was a social reformer. He's somebody who Voltaire said, "I don't really want any saints, but if I were to have one saint, it would be Saint Vincent de Paul." And almost a forerunner of the French Revolution in that respect, you could say. And so,
So how did he do his good works in his life?
well, mainly by trying to help the poor, and in fact, trying to deal with the 1%, so to speak, which was the French aristocracy. And in a certain sense, calling people to their Christian mission and their avowed values. I mean, I was thinking about that in relation to this Saturday Night Live skit about the Tebow
Yeah,
and
Tebow.
these people like Pat Robertson
Yes,
attacked
Pat
it.
Robertson.
And what I want to say is, well, why is your worry,
Yeah.
the Saturday Night Live skit, which I thought was very mild,
I hadn't seen it. I know
Yeah,
it's on
you
my
can YouTube
YouTube,
it,
but I
but-
just hadn't looked at it.
but why isn't the worry instead that everything that ought to be Christianity is cheapened by using it to celebrate a touchdown in a relatively meaningless entertainment event? And I say that as somebody who enjoys football and I watch
Yeah.
football, but why isn't that, why isn't that the worry?
But
And
I
the flip
think
side,
he
too, is-
personally didn't see it that way. It
Pat
was just,
Robertson?
no, Tebow.
Tebow,
I
no.
think he was just seeing it. It was his personal expression. Take it, leave it, whatever.
I'm
But
not
it
talking
just
about
took
him.
off.
Yeah,
Oh,
in
you're
a
talking
certain,
about
in a certain sense, yeah.
But you
he-
said something about it diminished Christianity
Well,
to use
I do
it
think
to
it-
celebrate
I
a
do think it
touchdown.
does in the sense that, well, if you're gonna praise God for making a touchdown, then don't you have to blame God when you don't make a touchdown? I mean, come
Yeah.
on, let's be fair here.
Right,
It's a
right.
little bit like it's a miracle if you find a baby alive in an earthquake, but somehow it's not an anti-miracle for the 100,000 who died.
Yeah, exactly.
And no, but I mean, Tebow, he's fun to watch, and maybe I'm just ticked off that the Bears blew another game, but I'm something of a Bears fan, and
Yeah.
it's hard to be a fan right now because they just blow it, but yeah, he seems like a sincere person of sincere convictions. That's not what I wouldn't even make fun of that, much less
Right, no,
much less
misunderstood, I think.
go against it.
Or
But
Pat
for Pat Robertson to think that the problem is
Well, if you Google,
this skit, which really was, the skit is just where they're celebrating in the locker room, Tebow and the others, and Jesus shows up and says, "Look, you guys need to do a little more work on your own. I got a lot of other people who need stuff from you." That's
you're
basically
overloading
that's
me.
basically the gist of the skit.
Yeah,
I mean,
I hadn't seen it.
that seems perfectly reasonable to me.
Yeah,
I don't-
right.
you
Well,
know,
I
I-
blasted Pat Robertson pretty bad on my blog, and I even did a show when he spoke out saying that the man who wanted to have an affair, his wife had Alzheimer's,
Oh, right,
that he
right.
should divorce her and all that. And
That was bizarre.
I
That
really
was-
got after him on that,
That was
and
really
so
bizarre.
I wrote a whole blog on that. In fact, that actually got picked up by another blog site. One of our sister companies through the Eagle Radio picked it up and put it up in Hayes. Thought that was the only one I've ever seen that happened to, so I was pretty excited about that, but I had to speak out.